Thank you to Pablo for the invitation. Thank you to Stony Brook. And this is the second of two presentations that I'm giving here at Stony Brook. Some of you were here yesterday. I think a few of you were here yesterday when I talked about the relationship between Mexico's democratization and its press from the mid-20th century to the recent past. And so today I'm going to resume, in some sense, that chronology. I'm going to talk about the state of Mexico's press today, but I'm also going to give a little history because the history is really important to understand the relationship between the current government in Mexico and the press. So AMLO refers to Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was president of Mexico from 2018 to 2024. Claudia Sheinbaum is the current president from the same party, the same left-wing party, Morena, Movimiento de Renovación Nacional. Morena, the word Morena is has a double meaning. It's an acronym for the movement of national renovation, but it's also the Spanish word for a dark-skinned person. And in the context of Mexico, where 90% of the population is non-white, it is a word that was designed to appeal to a large segment or the majority of the population that is either poor or of modest means.
Not in a derogatory way.
Not in a derogatory way, yes. And there's also perhaps an allusion to La Virgen Morena, which is another term for the Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. So here's a rundown of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to give a summary of what I talked about yesterday, the evolution of the press during the latter part of the 20th century and first decade of this century. First 18 years, in fact. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the press at the local level and the role of governors, because that's an aspect of the story that is sometimes omitted from discussions of the Mexican press. What's going on in the States? What's going on outside Mexico City? And then I'll talk more directly about López Obrador and how he really changed the relationship between power and the press as of taking office in 2018. And then the current situation under Claudia Sheinbaum. So, as I mentioned yesterday, as I discussed yesterday, Mexico's press, the majority of Mexico's press during most of the 20th century was oficialista. In other words, it was pro-government. It was often criticized as being a prensa vendida, a sell-out press. And here we have an example from 1968. This is the day after the infamous student massacre at the Plaza de Tlatelolco, 10 days before the Olympic Games were due to start in Mexico City, when student protesters were gunned down, many of them, by the army. And the coverage of Excelsior, the main newspaper in Mexico at the time, the most powerful newspaper at the time, very much told the government's side of the story and talked about combate as though there were two sides firing at each other, when we know that that the students were unarmed and were being fired upon. Now, starting in the little by little 70s and 80s, a few more independent titles are appearing, but the big watershed moment in my analysis and analysis in my book is the presidency of Carlos Salinas, who was president from 1988 to 1994. Now, I should mention that Mexico was ruled by a single party from 1929 until 2000. 71 years of uninterrupted rule, which I think the only equivalent is North Korea. So a single party which liked to think of itself as democratic. There were elections every 6 years, and there were opposition candidates. This was not the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, it was always the PRI that won. However, in 1988, a man called Carlos Salinas became president in a very disputed election, widely accused of fraud, and so after taking office, he decided because he had a credibility problem, he was going to start to change the relationship between the government and the press, a relationship which was one of interdependence. In other words, Excelsior received massive subsidies from the state and repaid those subsidies with positive coverage of the ruling party, the president, and so forth, the establishment in general. Salinas decided that he was going to regain some credibility by starting to ease the controls, the economic controls over the press that had been in place since the 1940s. And so he announced, I'm going to do away with the newsprint monopoly, the state-owned company that provided paper to magazines and newspapers. I'm going to reduce tariffs on imported paper from Canada and the US, so newspaper owners are free to source their newsprint from whoever they like. So a major mechanism of control over the press was suddenly removed. This was a sign to newspaper publishers that times were changing. Salinas also starts to negotiate with the US and Canada for a free trade agreement. And he needs to make the Americans and the Canadians, he wants to convince them that Mexico is in fact a functioning democracy. And so he in turn loosens some of the other controls that the government has been using. So for example, he reduces official advertising, which had been used to co-opt the press. He says to journalists, if you cover presidency, you're no longer going to get an envelope stuffed full of cash every 2 weeks, which was the norm in Mexico. And because of the negotiations with the US and Canada for the free trade agreement, many US and Canadian and also Japanese and European companies invest in Mexico. They become advertisers. The private sector advertising pie increases, and that also encourages newspaper publishers and magazine publishers to be less dependent upon government handouts and therefore less inclined to censor themselves. So we have various factors, and there are other factors I can mention too that are contributing towards a freer press. And so you could say there's a kind of an arc which is tending upwards in terms of freedom of expression in the press from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I would say it peaks in the late 90s and early 2000s. 2000 is a key year in Mexican history because the PRI is voted out of office, loses power for the first time, and the press has played an important role in that because from the early to late 90s, the press has been increasingly holding the government to account, exposing the inefficiencies of the ruling party, the PRI, giving space to opposition politicians, allowing them front page coverage. Reforma, which launches in 1993, puts the right of center PAN and the left of center PRD on the front page of its very first issue. The tradition in Mexico was when you launch a new newspaper, you put the PRI, the ruling party, on page 1 of your first edition. Reforma doesn't, and this is a major symbolic moment in the evolution of the press. So the PAN wins the presidency in the year 2000. And that is part of, I would say, a general democratizing trend in which the press is playing a part. And television too. The big TV company in Mexico, Televisa, which has been run by an imposing media mogul called Emilio Azcárraga Milmo, the Rupert Murdoch of Latin America. He dies in 1997, and he has always been a vocal soldier of the PRI. I mean, unabashedly pro-government in his newscasts. When his son takes over in 1997, he's only 29 years old, and he needs to stamp his own authority, his own personality on the company. And so he opens up newscasts to opposition politicians. So that too is part of the story. It's not just print media, it's also TV, which is opening spaces to opposition politicians. And the first president of the PAN, or the first PAN-affiliated president, Vicente Fox, 2000 to 2006. On his watch, Mexico finally gets a Freedom of Information Act, like the one you have here in the US, which enables journalists to ask for information from government sources and use this Freedom of Information Act as a legal basis for doing so. And that is a real boon to investigative journalism. I have the same error here that I had yesterday. This should say 2006 to 2012. So Calderon, who's also from the right of center pan, he comes in 2006, and Mexico is starting to experience a problem with what you might call performative violence by the drug cartels. I use the term drug cartels. I disagree with the term for various reasons. They don't just deal in drugs and they don't behave like cartels, but they're regularly referred to as drug cartels. So there's an infamous moment in 2005, I think it is, or early 2006, where in the context of a dispute between rival gangs in the state of Michoacan, which is where Calderon is from, a bunch of hooded guys enter a nightclub and with a sack, and they take 5 severed heads out of the sack and roll them across the floor of the nightclub as though they were bowling balls. That is a moment of outrageous, spectacular violence, and Calderon comes in pledging to do something about violence. The homicide rate is actually still falling, and it's been falling fairly consistently since the Mexican Revolution, which ended in 1920. But there's this performative violence which is grabbing headlines, and Calderon says, I'm going to do something about it. So he declares war against all of the cartels at once in December 2006, his first month in office. And the project is successful initially, but the problem when you decapitate a cartel, for example, you arrest or you kill a capo, is that there is very often a factional dispute within the cartel for control afterwards. Either that, or the neighboring cartel thinks, these guys are weakened, we can move in on their turf. Either way, you produce violence. And so in 2008, the homicide rate starts to increase very rapidly in Mexico. We're talking about, by the end of Calderon's term of office, 20 to 30,000 homicides a year. And journalists are getting caught up in this violence, either getting literally caught in the crossfire or being bumped off by criminal organizations who don't like the way that they're reporting about the violence. So the killing of journalists becomes a major... The killing of journalists, which has been an issue in Mexico since the 1970s. The first drug cartel-related hit was recorded in 1976 in Sinaloa. If you've seen the Netflix series Narcos Mexico, you're probably familiar with Sinaloa and El Chapo Guzman and so forth. Well, that's where he was from. So there is what I call a triple threat to press freedom as of 2006. The violence of the war on drugs, inter-cartel fighting, and so forth. In order to regain control or try to regain control of the news agenda in the context of an increasing number of dead bodies appearing on the front pages of Mexico's press, the Calderon government decides to vastly increase advertising in the press in order to co-opt newspapers and magazines. In other words, I'm going to buy lots of ad space in your paper. The implicit bargain being, and I expect you to treat me nicely and talk about the successes of the war on drugs and not the disasters, not the massacres. And newspapers are increasingly willing to take government money because they are now suffering, as of around 2009, about 4 or 5 years after the trend started in the US, of advertisers fleeing to the internet, spending their money on Google and Facebook. That becomes a big issue in Mexico as of around 2009. So you have these 3 threats to press freedom that are encouraging newspapers effectively to censor themselves. And that has always been the problem in Mexico. Not so much direct censorship, although there have been occasions of that. It's more the government encouraging newspaper editors to censor themselves, to withhold information. However, it's not all bad news. Towards the end of this presidential period, so from around 2010, we see the beginning of news websites, independent news websites. They've been around for about 10 years, but major investors get involved in around 2010. And these guys start to fill in the gaps, so to speak. They start to engage in the kind of investigative journalism that the newspapers have been doing, although some of them have stopped doing so because they've been bought off. When Peña Nieto comes in, he's from the PRI, the party that did rule Mexico for most of the 20th century. So the PRI get back into office in 2012. They claim that they are the new PRI. You know, we're not the same guys as before. We're not corrupt. We're very modern, all the rest of it. And they turn out to be pretty damn corrupt. And the press does a very good job in exposing that corruption. These two images refer to Proceso is the main news magazine in Mexico. It was launched in 1976. It was one of those moments in press history where something new arises, which is really critical and independent-minded, and they have to struggle really hard to stay in print, but they manage it. And so by 2012, they've got a history of investigative journalism, and they also have a reputation for very striking cover designs. And this is arguably their most famous ever cover. You have the presidential sash over the logo of Televisa, the TV quasi-monopoly, which has been backing Peña Nieto for about 7 years. They really cultivated Peña Nieto as their guy. I don't know if we can think of equivalents in other countries. Well, if any of you know the history of Brazil, there was a guy who was president of Brazil in the early 90s, whose name momentarily escapes me. Pablo, you'll remember. The guy that was cultivated by Globo. Collor de Mello, thank you. Yeah, so that would be a parallel to Televisa's cultivation of Peña Nieto. However, the websites in particular, I mean print media too, but particularly the websites, here's one called Aristegui Noticias. They found in 2014 that Peña and his wife, a former telenovela star, had a house built for them in a very ritzy part of Mexico City by a contractor who had previously been favored by Peña when he was governor of one of the states in Mexico. So this becomes a massive corruption scandal that hangs over Peña for the rest of his sexennial. And I have a chapter in my book, Peña Nieto, Invented by Television, Crushed by the Internet, because it's really websites like Aristegui Noticias, Animal Politico, and others that investigate him and his allies among the state governors and show just how corrupt they are. This is all really important because the narrative that the PRI is still corrupt, it's just as corrupt as it ever was, is a major factor behind the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, in 2018, which is a radical change in Mexican politics because Mexico hasn't had a vocally left-wing president since the 1970s. And here we have a massive change. The PRI is really center-right, from a center-right party to a decidedly center-left party in 2018. Now, before we get to AMLO fully, I want to talk a bit about journalism in the States, because it's pertinent to the situation now, and it's an area that's often overlooked when people talk about the press in Mexico. So here's a map of Mexico. This is taken from my book, and these are some of the media that I talk about in my book. And I obviously, if I had written about the press in every single state, my book would be 1,000 pages long. So I had to be selective, and I talk about the state of Puebla, for example. This is Sinaloa, where El Chapo is from. They have a couple of very good independent papers, and I'm going to talk about Puebla, and I'm also going to talk about this state here, Veracruz, which has traditionally been one of the most violent states in Mexico. So we'll talk about Puebla first, and I want to give you a couple of case studies. The first concerns Lydia Cacho. So Lydia Cacho, I believe she was originally from Mexico City, but she moved to Cancun in the 1990s and practiced independent freelance journalism. And she specialized in social inequality and in the sort of the ugly underside of that tourism mecca that is Cancun.
Writer, by the way.
She's a great writer. She's a great writer and a great investigator. And not only, she's what you might call an activist journalism, because she not only did a lot to expose the ugly underbelly of Cancun, she also, as she became aware of the exploitation of women in Cancun, forced prostitution and so forth, she set up a shelter for women who were in abusive relationships and so forth, or they had been tricked into prostitution. So she set up her own charity for those women in Cancun. During her investigations, she realized that there was a sex ring based in Cancun that was run by a Lebanese Mexican called Jean Sucar. And this guy trafficked in underage girls. And so she wrote an expose called Los Demonios del Edén, the demons of Eden. Eden, the paradise of Cancun, well, there are demons in paradise. And these demons are these men who are exploiting underage girls. The power to protect child pornography, it says. But it's not just pornography, it's also child prostitution. Now, when this book came out at the end of 2005, it had a fairly modest print run, I think 5,000 copies. But soon after it came out, a friend of Sucar, another Lebanese Mexican businessman who lived in the state of Puebla, he was known as the Denim King because he had factories that produced jeans for US consumption. And he got in touch with the governor of the state of Puebla and said, this woman is causing a lot of trouble for my friend. We need to do something about it. Can you do something about it? And he said, yes, I will send my police. So state police from Puebla, which is like 800 miles from Cancun, went down to Cancun, arrested, extrajudicially effectively, arrested Lydia Cacho and brought her by car back to Puebla. And during that trip, which she later described in a memoir, she was sexually harassed, and she was told that when we get to Puebla, we're going to basically, kill you. We're going to torture you, and we're going to kill you. So she was subject to this psychological torture. It was about a 24-hour road trip because it's quite a long way. And she was, when she got to Puebla, she managed through contacts. I think she was allowed one phone call, and so she called her then boyfriend, who was a major investigative journalist in Mexico City, and he got other people involved, and they were able to get her released on bail. And a couple of weeks later, it emerged that this Puebla industrialist was in divorce proceedings with his wife, and his wife had a private detective tapping his phone calls, and one of the calls he made was to the governor who had sent the cops to Cancun to arrest Lydia Cacho, and the call starts with Kamal Nassif, that's the name of the Puebla industrialist, congratulating the governor for arresting Lydia Cacho. And Marine, the governor, responds with, yeah, yesterday I gave that bitch a damn good slapping. And this is all recorded and then leaked to the press. So one of Mexico's major newspapers, La Jornada, gets a copy, and I think also Carmen Aristegui from Aristegui Noticias gets a copy, and this is a major scandal. And so Marine, the governor, is in disgrace, and Lydia Cacho it becomes a kind of a symbol of defiance of the evils of patriarchy, and this book, which had sold about 5,000 copies over December, January, suddenly becomes a bestseller. And I think here we have the second edition revised and updated, and I think eventually it sold something like 200,000 copies, which in Mexico is huge. So here we have an example of a brave journalist standing up to power, and she was sued by Sucar and she was sued by Nassif, and there were legal problems with the governor of Puebla too, and so for the next few years, she was really put through the ringer. I think the term in the US is lawfare, right? You use judicial mechanisms to go after inconvenient people such as journalists, and she was. She went through the depression that she was under, because even though she was freed from jail, the sort of the post-traumatic stress of that journey, coupled with the ongoing triple prosecution that she was facing, caused her to. I think it caused her physical problems, and her marriage broke down, and it was a really terrible tale. But she has a memoir, the name of which briefly escapes me. But if you Google it, you'll find it. It's available in English. Okay, so she was eventually exonerated. I believe she won the Moores Cabot Award. I mean, she's won a bunch of awards. She's a really celebrated journalist now, and she's written other books since. Okay, so that's one case. Now, Mario Marin, he's from the PRI. The next governor of Puebla was from the PAN, and the PAN had always, projected itself as we're right of center. Unlike the PRI, we're not corrupt, but. Often their politicians turned out to be as bad as those of the PRI. Lado B is a website that was started up in Puebla in 2011, and I believe some of you might be familiar with this text because I think you've circulated it. So if you're in Pablo's class, I apologize if you've heard this before, but I do want to read a few paragraphs from my book that give you a sense of persecution and how it is experienced by journalists. Ernesto Arroche lay face down on the floor while 3 men with guns ransacked the office of the news site he had founded. He was overwhelmed with anger and frustration. He thought, what can I do? What can I do? Lying near him, Meli Arellano, his partner in life and work, worried how Ernesto might react. They had been friends for 12 years and colleagues at several of Puebla's newspapers. She knew he did not scare easily and feared he might do something rash. After the burglars left, their arms full of loot, Arroche sprang up and chased them out onto the street. A colleague ran after him and restrained him. But the burglars were anyway too quick, a waiting car speeding them into the December dusk. The 3 journalists took stock of the damage to their operation, the small and bold online news magazine Lado B. The thieves had taken 6 laptops, several cell phones, backpacks, and a haul of company documents. They had been quick. They had yelled at the journalists to get down on the fucking floor. After that, they had not spoken. Having given their their statements to the police and visited the district attorney's office, Arroche convened his editors and reporters at the home of a friend, and they all debated what had happened. The professionalism of the thieves suggested off-duty cops. This is, by the way, quite common. Authorities in Mexico using off-duty cops to hassle journalists. Lado B had only launched 5 months before, in July 2011. Whom had it offended? The likeliest suspect, they came to agree, was the state's Secretary for Public Security, Ardelio Vargas. A renowned hardliner, Vargas was a Puebla native who had risen in national law enforcement, first in the army, then in the Secret Service, and finally in the federal police. In the last capacity, he gained infamy for involvement in the bloody repression of 2006 at Atenco in the state of Mexico, where locals were protesting plans for a Mexico City airport. Hundreds had been arrested, 2 killed, and many women allegedly abused and raped by the police. Then in early 2011, Vargas was called back to Puebla by the new hardline governor, Rafael Moreno Valle Rosas of the PAN. As chief of law enforcement, Vargas lived up to his reputation for intolerance of social protest. His state police harassed and arrested marchers, made illegal searches of homes, and allegedly tortured detainees, in one case with electric shocks to the testicles. Lado B, founded on principles of public service, covered it all. Vargas accused of being the greatest repressor that Puebla has had, ran one headline, quoting a complaint from 35 civic organizations. A week before the burglary, The site ran a mocking cartoon of Vargas as a tubby version of Calimán, a turbaned superhero of 1970s comics, known for his detective skills and great strength. A police beat reporter told them that the picture bothered Vargas a lot. Nonetheless, Oroche and his team would never succeed in conclusively linking the burglary to Vargas, and the perpetrators would never be traced, which is standard practice in Mexico. 90% impunity rates for crime in general. The only thing we cannot do is give up, because then they win, Oroche told his colleagues on the night of the incident. So I cite this case because there is, I think, a perception that violence against the press is a narco issue in Mexico, and it very much of the violence against the press is drug cartel related, but there's also a lot of violence that is perpetrated by authorities, particularly state authorities, municipal authorities, police chiefs, and so forth. And so these two examples from Puebla are cases of that. Now, Veracruz, under Javier Duarte, who was governor between 2010 and 2016, is a slightly different case. Because Duarte came to office at a time when the drug cartels had really entered into Veracruz in a big way. So under his predecessor, Fidel Herrera, several criminal organizations basically set up shop in Veracruz, and Herrera is largely credited with having allowed that to happen. On Duarte's watch, the killing of journalists in the state of Veracruz, which has already become fairly pronounced by national standards, really becomes a horrific trend. So something like 20 murders of journalists are documented on his watch. So that's about 3 a year, just in one single state. And but Duarte does very little to solve those cases. One of his tendencies is to blame the victim, and this is something that we see often happening in Mexico, particularly at the local level, where a journalist, typically a police beat reporter, someone who writes about crime, these are the guys who are really on the front line of violence against the press. It's crime beat reporters and photojournalists. Those are the most frequently bumped off in the last 20 or 30 years. And so he would convene a press conference and he would say, well, this guy, it's terrible that he got killed, pero me cuentan que anduvo en malos pasos. But I hear that the guy was up to no good. Or I hear that the guy was hanging out with the wrong kind of people. Now, if you are a crime reporter, you might sometimes interview criminals, or you might sometimes interview people who are corrupt. But there is this tendency to sort of, brush homicide cases under the carpet, or give them what's known in Mexico a carpetazo, which means you put the documents, the file in a folder, and you put that in a filing cabinet, and nothing happens. So this was standard practice under Duarte's watch. I use this particular image from Proceso, the magazine I mentioned earlier, because the photojournalist who took this image, which Duarte hated because it made him look fat, was himself killed in Mexico City a few years after this photo was taken. Now, this became a cause célèbre because it is very, very rare that journalists are killed in Mexico City. As I think I was talking about this yesterday and perhaps this morning in Pablo's class. I think it's somewhere in the 90s, let's say 95% of journalists killed in Mexico are killed in the States, even though the population of Greater Mexico City, which is about 25 million, is, let's say, 15 to 20% of the population of the country, but only 4 or 5% of journalists are killed in that area. It's really a problem in states like Veracruz and elsewhere. So when Rubén Espinosa, the photojournalist who took this picture, was killed along with 4 other people in an apartment in Colonia Narvarte, which is a middle-class neighborhood in Mexico City, it was a national scandal. And an investigation took place, and this is an example of the complexity of violence against the press and solving the issue, because the four people who were killed with him, they were all women, and one of them was a Colombian who was she didn't have a fixed income. She was believed to have had friendships with people in criminal gangs, and she had a late model Ford Mustang or some kind of fancy sports car parked in the street. So as the investigation took place, there were two sort of competing theories as to what had caused this quintuple homicide. There were those, particularly those many people in the press, some of whom knew Rubén Espinosa, said this is Duarte acting, outside the state of Veracruz to bump off this periodista incómodo, this bothersome journalist who took this photo of him and who is also involved in protests against Duarte's rule. He had covered protests. He was an activist journalist, Rubén Duarte. So one school of thought is this was Duarte's revenge. Another school of thought, which the police and the prosecutors pursued, was that the intended victim of the hit was this Colombian woman, and the others were bumped off too because they were witnesses to the killing. And the reaction of the press to that was, you're blaming the victim. You're claiming that this woman, this Colombian woman, was a sex worker, and this is an example of misogyny, and this is an example of blaming the victim, and you're not bothering to follow up leads that might point to Duarte. In the end, the case was never solved. No one was ever prosecuted, and we're left with these two competing theories. And that too, unfortunately, is typical. One of the greatest tragedies of violence against the press in Mexico is the unknowability of what happened, what really happened. I have a database of killings of Mexican journalists dating from the late 19th century to the present. There are 400 cases. Of those cases, about 2%, about 10% have been brought to justice in the sense that the hitman was arrested and jailed. But the hitman is rarely also the mastermind. The hitman is usually sent by someone in authority to bump off the journalist. Masterminds have been jailed 1% of the time, maybe 2% of the time. Okay, so what's happening under López Obrador? I'll speed up a bit. López Obrador entered office in December 2018, and almost right from the start had a very conflictive relationship with the press. And in order to understand why, we have to know a little bit about López Obrador's history. López Obrador, a leftist politician from the state of Tabasco, ran for governor of Tabasco twice, in 1988 and 1994. And in both cases, he found that almost all of the press were against him because they were in the pay of the local government. Now, an exception was Tabasco Hoy. Tabasco Hoy, this evidently sensationalistic newspaper, vendió a su hija al amante. He sold his daughter to his lover. That's the kind of headline that it would run. Anyway, so Tabasco Hoy is launched in late 1987, just as the campaign for governor of the state of Tabasco is starting up. And they back López Obrador. And this is their way of establishing their credentials as we're a serious newspaper. Yeah, we're tabloid, but we're serious because, we're giving voice to the opposition, and therefore, we are contributing to the democratization of the state of Tabasco. All of the rest of the press is anti-AMLO. They are in favor of the PRI candidate, right? However, after the election, when the PRI inevitably win, Tabasco Hoy switches sides and becomes an oficialista organ, a pro-government organ. And the next time that López Obrador runs for office in 1994, they're still with the PRI. They're anti-AMLO. Okay, so in 1991, when midterm elections come up, or on the horizon in Tabasco, AMLO founds his own newspaper, La Verdad del Sureste, the truth of the Southeast. It's a southeastern state, Tabasco. And here we see AMLO's attitude towards the press really in play, because to him, the press is either for you or against you. He's not interested in pluralism per se. He's interested in having his own propaganda organ. And I've interviewed several editors of this paper who have told me that at one time or another they would say to AMLO, look, let's open up our pages, let's reinvent ourselves as a truly pluralistic newspaper. Let's have at least a few columnists who represent the other party or who have, let's say, neutral opinions about politics or shaded opinions, nuanced opinions. And he didn't want any of that. He didn't want to go in that direction. He just wanted a propaganda sheet that would take his side in political conflicts or political competitions. He was portrayed after taking part in a protest, a peaceful protest. He was beaten. We don't know if it was on purpose or accidentally, but here he is with a blood-stained shirt, and this paper, this magazine Proceso, put him on the cover in his blood-stained shirt. And this was a key moment in his evolution from regional politician to politician with a national profile. A few months after this magazine comes out, he is elected as president of the PRD, which was the main left-wing party in Mexico at the time, and from there he went on to become mayor of Mexico City, and then he ran for president 3 times and won on the 3rd occasion. So we know that he has this kind of Manichaean view of the press. It's either for me or against me. And when he comes in, the first thing he wants to do, and he announces this even before he takes office, is I'm going to reconstitute the relationship that this unfortunate, in fact, this corrupt relationship between the government and the press, whereby the government has been subsidizing the press, buying off journalists, and allowing some journalists, columnists in particular, to get very rich on the government dime. So I'm going to cut official advertising by 50%. In the end, he cuts it by 80%. That might sound like a good thing, but if you cut subsidies by such an amount, you're going to reduce the capacity of the press to do a good job. And traditionally, Mexican media have played a kind of a balancing act, whereby they'll take a certain amount of government advertising, either local or federal advertising, but they'll still try to do good reporting, try to do balanced reporting, try to hold power to account. I mean, they'll choose their battles, you might say. But with such a vast reduction in advertising, one of the of official advertising, one of the upshots is a decline in investigative and balanced journalism.
And also there's other sectors that go fill out that void, right? Like narco money.
Well, narco money is there's some evidence of narco money coming into newsrooms at the state level. The other major change that he institutes is a morning press conference every day of the week. Now, Peña, his predecessor, spoke to the press on about 3 occasions during the whole 6 years. AMLO speaks to the press every single Monday to Friday. He gives 1,400 press conferences during his 6 years in office. And so he's able to set the news agenda. These take place from 7 o'clock in the morning until 9. And so he's able to set the news agenda and thereby dominate the news on his terms throughout his 6 years in office. So this is a radical change in press power relations. He also uses a very combative rhetoric, and here again I'm going to refer to his background in Tabasco, whereby those media that dare to criticize him are met with ad hominem or worse responses from the president during his morning press conference. And one of the ironies here is that media such as Proceso, Aristegui, Animal Politico, which had done much to facilitate his election by exposing the corruption of the ruling party during the previous 6 years, allowing AMLO to campaign on, in great part, on a platform of anti-corruption. We're going to get rid of this corrupt party that's in power. How do we know it's corrupt? Well, look at all these stories. Those same media that exposed corruption under the PRI are now being vilified as conservative, or the posh press, or even the mob, because they dare to raise questions about his presidency or the effectiveness of his policies. So we enter a period of polarization, whereby as the press as many media are attacked, they take a more combative stance towards him. Other media that side with him take a combative stance towards the critical media. And so you have a kind of a bifurcation of the media in Mexico, which is already, you have media on various positions of the ideological spectrum already, but they tend to go towards the edges, not so much in a right and left sense, but in a sense of either being pro-government or critical of the government or holding the government to account. Okay? And as I mentioned, with less money available, it's not only cuts in government advertising, it's also private sector advertising is continuing to decline. Companies like supermarkets and so forth are spending less on newspaper ads, and so journalism is really in a pretty bad shape. Another important factor of the media landscape, a new factor, is influencers. So at these press conferences, the front row of the press conference, those journalists who are typically called upon first when the press conference turns to question and answer, come to be dominated by YouTubers and other influencers who typically ask the president softball questions. In some cases, typically it's, Mr. President, what do you think about such and such? As opposed to, Mr. President, this happened, what are you going to do about it? It's, what do you think about such and such? Or even, Mr. President, how does it feel to be, according to this recent poll, the most popular president in the world? Or, Mr. President, that kind of, brown-nosing, that degree of brown-nosing would take place in the press conferences. And so, and because of the growing presence of these media, these YouTubers, serious media became much more selective about how often they would bother to show up at the press conference. And so that also contributed to a polarization. Right. Now, I should mention, by the way, that there's a common conspiracy theory that these guys are all on the payroll of the government. They may have received some official advertising, but they really didn't need to because they were so popular. I mean, look at the subscriber numbers, 1.39 million, 1.45 million. She's younger, she's got 492,000. These guys get millions of views, and thanks to the YouTube compensation model, that produces hard cash. That produces advertising revenue for these influencers. They are, in other words, able to monetize their stridency. The more strident they are in their support of AMLO and in their denunciation of AMLO's critics, whether they are journalists or columnists or opposition politicians, the more clicks they get, the more views they get. And they're very good. They're very good at what they do. So this, too, has contributed to a polarized media landscape and a rise in disinformation. Here we have Here we have some stats from a report that came out from Article 19. Some of you might have heard it. It's an NGO based in London. There are 3 major NGOs, international NGOs, that do a good job monitoring press freedom in Mexico. Article 19 from London, Reporters Without Borders from Paris, and the CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists from New York. So this is an article from an Article 19 report that came out just a few months ago. It shows what the federal government has been spending on official advertising, what state governments have been spending, and the totals. So you can see the last year of Peña Nieto, Peña was spending, I mean, this is $500 million. $500 million. Peña in total spent $3 billion during his 6-year period on official advertising, basically trying to make himself look good. So AMLO comes in and vastly cuts it, and cuts it even more for the rest of the 6-year period. But the state governments, their expenditure is still pretty high. So if you're a newspaper in the provinces, you're no longer getting much support from the federal government, but you are very much reliant on the state government. What effect is that going to have? Well, you're going to be that much more inclined to make the governor look good. So here we see co-optation going on in the states. Here's our current president, Claudia Sheinbaum. She has continued the practice of the mañaneras, the morning press conferences, but her rhetoric is very different. She is much less combative. She is much less given to vilifying journalists who are critical. There was one journalist, Carlos Loret de Mola, who during the AMLO years was criticized by name on 700 occasions. In other words, every other press conference he was mentioned as a bad guy. Other critical journalists were mentioned 300 or 400 times. Claudia Sheinbaum has almost entirely done away with that ad hominem critique of those who are trying to hold her government to account. She can be evasive, but at least that element of what has been making journalism, if not dangerous, a precarious and uncomfortable profession over the previous 6 years, that element has been diminished. However, the independent press is still living precariously. There is still very little support, very little government advertising spent on media that are either balanced or critical. Government advertising is almost entirely going to pro-government outlets, whether it's TV or print or online. So what solutions might we propose? Well, less vilification of the press. Yes, Sheinbaum has undertaken that. And this is important, I think, because, and of course it's hard to connect these two empirically, but there is a sense in which during the AMLO sexennial, during his term of office, as he talked about, as he vilified most of the press in general, he was often criticized for maintaining a discourse that communicated indirectly to criminals, corrupt politicians around the country that you can kill a journalist and get away with it. Because these people, they're not good people. They're chayoteros, they're bribe takers. And that criticism resonated because for much of the 20th century, journalists were bribe takers. But AMLO and his circle and the influencers I've shown would use that term, chayotero, you're a bribe taker, of anyone who dared to criticize AMLO. So that was, I think, a very dangerous kind of rhetoric. There are other things that are still needing to be done. In about 2010, a special prosecutor's office was set up to investigate the murders of journalists if it could be determined that the journalist was killed for his or her reporting. And this office was very ineffective for the first 6 or 7 years. But then a new guy came in under pressure. Peña put in a new guy in 2017 who started to get convictions. But when AMLO came in 2 years later, he reduced that office's budget by about 30%. And Sheinbaum has yet to restore it the budget to its previous level. So that's a pending item. Improvements to the mechanism. There is a federal mechanism for the protection of journalists. You can enroll in it. They'll give you a panic button. They'll give you emergency numbers to call. In extreme circumstances, they will actually relocate you from where you are to Mexico City so you can live in relative safety. But it's been criticized by a lot of people in the press as being relatively ineffective. And I think what I would most favor, perhaps the most important change that could be effected, although there are no signs it's going to happen soon, are an independent subsidy body, such as they have in much of Western Europe. So starting in the late 60s, early 70s, countries like the Netherlands and Norway, which are small countries, noted that small-town newspapers were starting to disappear. And so they instituted subsidy bodies that would provide government money to small-town newspapers to allow them to carry on with, to survive. These subsidy bodies came to be protected against political influence. In other words, they were controlled by people who were not, party members. You had independent supervision of these subsidy bodies, and now most Western European countries have these institutions. I think Britain and Germany are the only two that don't, because their economies are relatively big. But there's one in Spain, for example, which subsidizes Catalan language media. I would favor that for Mexico, because it's clear that given disposable income levels, it's very hard for a newspaper or even a website today to survive from advertising and subscriptions alone. Support is needed. Where's it going to come from? Is it going to come from the private sector, like philanthropists like Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post? Well, that can present problems, right? In fact, I can only think of one single case in Mexico of a philanthropist, in other words, a business person buying a medium. There's a magazine called Gato Pardo, which is a monthly magazine that does does very good work.
I used to write for them.
I'm sorry?
I wrote for them.
You wrote for them? Right, yeah. So Gato Pardo was bought by a member of the Legorreta family, a banking family, a few years ago, right? And so he effectively rescued them. But that's the only case I can think of. In the US, it's more common. And I think that's, here's a final chart to show why this is still such an issue. So here we have numbers of journalists killed per year since 2008. And under Claudia Sheinbaum came in October 2024, but here's 2025, 7 journalists. Different NGOs, CPJ, Reporters Without Borders, Article 19, this is from Article 19, have different ways of registering whether a journalist has been killed. Because, for example, if you're a taxi driver and you also have a Facebook page where you post news, are you a journalist? I mean, some would say yes, some would say no. So the measures differ according to the NGO. There's one NGO that's saying that so far this year 10 journalists have been killed. But even 7 is 7 too many. And by historical an analysis, it's around the average. So in other words, the Sheinbaum presidency, the Sheinbaum administration has a lot of work to do to make things better for journalists. I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple of questions, but I'm going to take the privilege of being the host to ask at least one.
Mm-hmm.
So the question for me is important because it's never very clear to me where that money in the 80s comes from to fund all this new newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
Reforma, for instance, which is not a small newspaper.
Yeah.
Where does the money come from?
Mm-hmm. Well, Reforma may be a bit of a one of a kind, because Reforma was founded by a guy called Alejandro Junco, who was from a newspaper family based in Monterrey. And they had a paper called El Norte, which was launched in the 1930s and was enjoyed a lot of support from the Monterrey industrial elite. Those of you who know Mexico may know that Monterrey is really the sort of the industrial heartland of Mexico. Many major corporations, Mexican corporations, are based there, and so through their support, they were one of the first newspapers in Mexico to wean itself from government subsidies. So by the 1970s, it's already a pretty independent newspaper. I mean, it's obviously they don't go investigating their sponsors. But in terms of their political coverage, they are pluralistic from a fairly early time. And it becomes such a successful newspaper that by 1993, when Junco launches Reforma in Mexico City, they're able to do so with a panoply of private advertisers that come in to support Reforma. So Reforma launches with, I think, only about 5% government advertising.
Yeah, that's kind of a very unusual case.
It is unusual, although it played out to a lesser extent with other launches in the 80s and 90s, where local. So there's a paper in Sinaloa called Noroeste, where the local business elite really got behind it.
Questions? Yeah.
I have a quick question. As you touched upon the funding for different papers, what does the competition look like between different papers? Like, is it competitive for like an exclusive story, like, or is it just like everyone's covering the same thing? Like, I know like it's a competition for like sources, and of course papers want to get exclusives. So, what does that look like?
That's a great question, because in the golden age of the PRI, so when this party that ran Mexico for 71 years was in its pomp, in the 1970s, for example, you would look at the headlines that Mexico City already had about 20 newspapers. This is something else I should have perhaps mentioned, that there's an excess of press in Mexico, or traditionally has been, because most newspapers are not launched to be businesses. They're not like Reforma. They are launched as political tools. In other words, they are, in economic terms, loss leaders. I'm going to have a newspaper that has, that's going to lose a lot of money, but I'm going to use it as a political tool to press politicians to give me concessions, to give me contracts and so forth for my pre-existing businesses. So back in those years, you would look at the front pages and they'd all pretty much be saying the same thing. But in the 90s, when Reforma launches and other independent newspapers launch, you have a new culture of investigative journalism. I mean, there are some precedents in the 70s and 80s, but it becomes much more of a thing in the 90s. And so papers are really competing for stories. Now, a concrete example of that is El Universal. So El Universal is like Excelsior. It was founded at the end of the Mexican Revolution. It had always been pro-government. But by the mid-90s, El Universal saw that Reforma was eating its lunch. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to change our newspaper from being pro-government to being pluralistic. We're going to hire critical columnists. We're going to set up our own investigative news unit. The co-author of my first book was a member of that investigative unit. So I had a kind of insight into what was going on at that paper. And so I would say since the early 90s, there has been much more competition for news. Yeah. But in the States, partly due to this, re-co-opting of state-level newspapers, if you go to Puebla, for example, which still has something like 10 daily papers, it's a city of 2 million. I mean, it's a city the size of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, I think, has 2. Puebla has 10. Again, they're mostly used for political influence. And if you look at the front page headlines, they'll mostly be the same.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
I was going to say, I don't know if you know, but like the answer, but when you said that the PRI got voted out after their 71 years, was it by a landslide? Like, did the press influence like the population that much where it was like a big difference? Because then they got voted in another 6 years later.
It was, I wouldn't say it was a landslide because it was a three-way race, and most presidential elections since 94 have had 3 major candidates. So it's not, this sort of these guys or these guys like it is in the States, Republicans and Democrats. But the guy who came in, it was a fairly wide margin that he was, and it was not just the press. It was also the fact that he was very telegenic. He was this tall guy from Guanajuato. He'd been a state governor. He'd also been chief executive of Coca-Cola Mexico. So, he knew about marketing, and his product was himself. And he was very good at marketing himself. He'd sometimes wear a cowboy hat. He'd wear cowboy boots. He would make pronouncements that were kind of vulgar, but had a ring, were enjoyed, let's say, by the public. He had people working for him that really knew how to market him on TV ads and so forth. And so that was a big part of the story too. Yeah.
Yes, as you talk about the topic of how journalists are not being killed just by narcos, but also by
corrupt politicians. Yeah.
I was wondering if you have talked with journalists and about how they're protecting themselves from being killed when reporting investigative journal.
Mm-hmm. It's not something that I've done specifically myself, although it does come up in interviews. I interviewed about 180 people for this book. But there are, starting in around the time that the homicide rate started to shoot up, certain journalists, there were a couple of, they tend to be women, Marcela Turati, Daniela Pastrana are two cases that formed organizations specifically to train journalists in how to protect themselves when reporting on crime or when reporting on corruption. That's one thing. Another thing is that, again, starting around the same time, in parts of Mexico where journalists had been killed, many reporters would come together in informal collectives that would hold workshops about how to protect yourself, that would engage in reporting in teams. So it's always, you minimize risk if you go in twos or threes to cover, let's say, some shootout, or if you do an investigation into corruption. So there has been an increase, let's say, in solidarity among journalists that has helped temper risk. Yeah.
Andrew, you talked about Lidia Cacho, now Marcela Turati, and Gato Pardo magazine. So you're familiar with the genre of crónica, right?
Right.
How, and I'm asking from the point of view of an Anglo speaker, what is the main difference between crónica and literary journalism, if you can articulate the difference?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Crónica, which literally means chronicle, perhaps in English, is long-form narrative journalism, and it's very popular in Latin America. Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize winner for literature, was a practitioner of crónica. Elena Poniatowska, and crónica is perhaps it has a higher standing in Mexico or in Latin America than, let's say, in the US, because crónica is very often published in newspapers and magazines. So I think the tradition of long-form narrative in the US has more or less disappeared from newspapers. You still find it in magazines, like obviously the New Yorker. That would be the maximum, the greatest example. But in Mexico, you still find crónica in newspapers. So I think it's perhaps a more popular form. And another aspect of crónica that's very important is giving voice to the people. So crónica is not just your subjective impressions of something that's going on. You're also incorporating a lot of interviews and interweaving those into what you write. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for one more question.
I have discounted copies of the book for $25 for anyone who wants one.
Yeah. We have one more question.
I'd love to think more about these fascinating mañaneras, like these morning press conferences. I mean, and sometimes it looks like it is just like a typical bully pulpit, the kind of typical abuse of executive power. For all the reasons that you said that accomplish all the things that you said. But as someone who's studied AMLO's trajectory, like where does it come from? Like,
he began the mañanera when he was mayor of Mexico City.
I see.
And it almost began by accident. In fact, it was kind of accidental, because he promised when he was running for mayor of Mexico City that he would start work at 6 every morning. And so at the beginning of his period as mayor, a few journalists would congregate outside City Hall to see if he really did show up at 6. And he did. And so when they would take that opportunity to sort of shout questions at him. And they'd be out. I mean, the terms of office in Mexico begin in December. Okay, so it's December. It's 6 o'clock in the morning. You're cold, and you're standing out there waiting for the president or the mayor to show up. And so after this had been going on for a few weeks, his entourage or his press flacks decided we should let these journalists inside the building. So the journalists were allowed inside the building. And then we should let them ask the president a few more questions. And so it kind of almost organically evolved into a morning press conference every morning. And he held 1,000 of them, I think, when he was mayor, or maybe 800, because he stepped down as mayor in mid-2005 to run for presidency.
Like what Zelensky does in Kiev. It's a channeled digital charisma.
You're right.
And if you think of it, like you can start with Hugo Chavez, who's constantly on the media.
Yeah.
And then the mañaneras were also the Ecuadorian president
Correa,
right? He was doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Or, of course, on the other side.
But was he doing it daily?
Yeah.
Chavez had a weekly show, didn't he?
Chavez had a weekly show, but
called Allo Presidente.
every time in the media, Chavez's was a weekend.
Yeah.
Correa was every day.
Okay.
Think about the other side, though. One of the things that created the credibility gap in Vietnam was every day the generals had a 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Okay.
5 o'clock volleys. So there has to be at least an element of truth-telling or not obnoxious lying every day.
Right, and I don't want to stereotype the Mañaneras as simply a propaganda exercise, because one of the defenses of the Mañanera, there are several. One is that the government really is informing the people. So in a Mañanera is not just the president talking to the press, it's the president plus one or two ministers who are giving concrete information about what they're doing in, let's say, Tuesdays was health policies. Every Tuesday, the Minister of Health would be there with several of his junior secretaries, giving information about what we're doing to renovate hospitals around Mexico, what we're doing to combat the COVID virus. So there would be that. And then, when he took another defense, is that as the president took questions, he was finding out about specific problems in specific states, because a lot of the journalists there would be from the provinces, and they would stand up and say, in Jalapa, Veracruz, we have this problem with contaminated water. What can you tell us about your intention to help us with this problem, Mr. President? And so his people would be writing down, and if he didn't have an instant response, he would say, I'll get back to you tomorrow or in a couple of days once we've looked at it, and he would do. So it was often defended by the government as a way of, as a sort of daily exercise in democracy and in good governance. We are finding out what are the problems, the daily problems facing the population, and we are going to do something about it.
Can I just have a quick one as well?
Yeah.
What about comparisons with Trump, who's far more available to the media than Joe Biden ever was?
Yes.
He's introduced influencers into his briefing.
Yes, he has, hasn't he?
Very selective about who he invites into the Oval Office. He routinely turns on journalists who ask him questions and say, well, you belong to the fake news media,
Yes.
and singles them out.
Yes.
So,
Yes, there are very much parallels.
Whether, and also, what is AMLO and Claudia Sheinbaum's relationship to the truth when they give those press conferences?
There's a book about the press conferences of AMLO, which was published about midway through his period. If I recall correctly, it was called El Imperio de los Otros Datos, the Empire of the Other Figures. He had famously or infamously answered a question early on in his period, in his administration, when someone had presented him with data that showed some kind of problem.
Alternative facts.
Yo tengo otros datos. I have other figures. He didn't say what those were or where he got them from. He just. But this became almost like a symbol of his refusal to acknowledge empirical data that showed problems of one kind or another during his term of office. The same guy that wrote this book tabulated how many untruths he had issued during his presidency and came up with, I think, several thousand. Now, I think that too is, there's been something of a change with Claudia. I think she is, she tells partial or misleading or untruthful information much less frequently than AMLO. She can, like I said, she can still be evasive. She can still, I think, sometimes misinform. But AMLO did it almost automatically. Although that said, it's hard to say how much he was lying, because lying implies intentionality, doesn't it? Really.
What is fascinating is the different outcome, right? Because Trump's popularity ratings have plummeted, whereas AMLO and Sheinbaum,
yes,
you were saying.
Yeah, he left office with a 70% approval rating. Sheinbaum's approval rating has come down a little over the last year. She's been in office for just over a year, but it's still around 70%. Yeah.
So the difference between the reaction of the audiences is kind of very.
Yeah, but it's not just the media. It's not just the press conference. It's also the fact that AMLO instituted several welfare policies that have been very popular. So there's a universal pension, for example. Anyone over 60 or 65 gets 3,000 or 4,000 pesos a month. That's about $150, which if you're poor is a lot of money.
Policy and not perception.
Well, it's both. It's both. And I think one reason why AMLO, a key reason why AMLO was so popular throughout his presidency was that his rhetoric, which was very much, I represent the people, and the people who are criticizing me are from the elite, was substantiated or rooted by social policy. So it was pensions, and it was also raising the minimum wage. This was the most important thing he did. Didn't get as much attention as the pensions, but he raised the minimum wage by 15 or 16% a year. Previously, it had gone up by 5% a year, and that helped. That was the most important factor in bringing 13 million Mexicans out of poverty during his presidency. And that's been confirmed by an autonomous agency in Mexico which has a very respected chief officer. So, he's done tangible things. This is not like Trump saying prices are falling, and everyone can see that prices are rising. No, there are tangible policy accomplishments that go with this, that are attached to his record.
I saw a hand over there. No? Okay.
Well, right. I'm happy to stick around for a little while and discuss Mexico further with anyone who would like.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.